All right, welcome to a deep dive all about Disney.
Ooh, fun.
Yeah, you know those classic heartwarming stories, all the sing-alongs,
Right.
happily ever afters, all that good stuff.
Yeah.
Well, today we're going to be looking at a proposed podcast script
Okay.
that shines a light on what it calls Disney darkness.
Ooh, Disney darkness.
Yeah, so think like hidden messages,
Okay.
questionable themes, maybe even a bit of social engineering.
Interesting.
So let's get into it. Right off the bat, this script mentions hidden messages
Okay.
in Disney films, and we've all heard those fan theories,
Of
right?
course.
Like
Yeah.
in The Lion King,
Yeah.
when Mufasa dies and there's that dust cloud,
Uh-huh.
some people believe that it spells out SEX.
Really?
Yeah, and Disney denies it, of course,
Right.
but it makes you wonder,
Yeah, it does.
why are we so obsessed with finding these hidden meanings?
I think it's interesting because it really kind of speaks to
Yeah.
our desire to find a deeper meaning, even in something that's as seemingly simple as like a children's film.
Right.
It almost suggests that we know
Yeah.
that stories have a power to influence us, even subconsciously.
Yeah. So are we like reading too much into things, or is there something to these theories? Like
Right.
this script also mentions that whispered line in Aladdin
Oh, yeah, yeah.
where some people believe he says, "Good teenagers, take off your clothes,"
Uh-huh.
which turned out to be a technical glitch,
Right.
but it definitely sparked a lot of debate.
Exactly. And I think that's where critical thinking comes in, right?
Yeah.
Just because there's a theory doesn't make it true. You
Right.
got to evaluate the evidence,
Yeah.
consider the source
Mm-hmm.
and form our own conclusions.
Okay, so maybe not every fan theory holds water.
Right.
But what about the broader themes in
Yeah.
these films? Like, this script suggests that a lot of Disney classics are centered around
Uh-huh.
obedience, control, even punishment.
Ooh.
Like, doesn't that seem a bit dark for a children's movie?
Well, I mean, I think it's important to remember that fairy tales,
Yeah.
even before Disney, were often used to reinforce
Yeah.
societal norms and expectations.
Mm-hmm.
They were cautionary tales,
Yeah.
warning children about the consequences of disobedience,
Yeah.
straying from the path, that kind of thing.
Right, like in The Little Mermaid, Ariel literally gives up her voice to be with Prince Eric.
It's true.
Isn't that a little messed up?
Yeah.
Like, on the surface, romantic gesture.
Yeah.
But some might argue that it reinforces this idea
Mhm.
that women should be seen and not heard.
Right.
So how does that square with Disney's image of wholesome family values?
It's a really good point, and I think
Yeah.
it raises an important question about like the evolution of these stories.
Yeah.
Disney took these classic tales, often with,
Huh.
really dark origins, and adapted them for
Yeah.
a modern audience. But in doing so,
Yeah.
did they sanitize them to the point where the original meaning,
Uh-huh.
or at least like the original darkness, was lost?
Right. And if so, is that a good or a bad thing?
Yeah.
Like, I get wanting to make these stories palatable for kids,
Right.
but are we shielding them from, like, important lessons about
Yeah.
the complexities of life? What do you think?
It's such a delicate balance,
Yeah.
because on the one hand, you have this desire
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
preserve the essence of these timeless stories.
Right.
But on the other hand, you have this responsibility to present them in a way
Yeah.
that's appropriate and engaging
Yeah.
for like a contemporary audience.
So it's not just about dumbing down the stories,
Right.
but finding a way to make them resonate with modern viewers while still conveying those,
Yeah.
underlying themes and messages.
It's true.
And that's where Disney's brilliance comes in,
Yes.
right? They managed to create these like incredibly popular
Yeah.
and enduring films that are both entertaining and thought-provoking,
Yeah.
even if we don't always realize it.
Precisely. And that's why it's so fascinating
Yeah.
to delve into these stories,
Mhm.
to peel back the layers and uncover those subtle nuances
Yeah.
that might have escaped our notice as children.
Right.
Think about it. What Disney films did you watch growing up?
Oh, wow.
And how do you view them now?
That's a really good question.
Yeah.
I'm suddenly seeing those childhood favorites
Yeah.
in a whole new light.
Right.
It's like realizing there's a whole other story going on beneath the surface.
It's like discovering a secret passageway
Whoa.
in a familiar house,
Okay.
leading to this hidden room you never knew existed.
Yeah, I like that.
And that's what makes this deep dive so exciting, isn't it?
Yeah.
We're exploring those hidden rooms,
Uh-huh.
those unexplored corners of the Disney universe.
This is definitely more than just a trip down memory lane.
For sure.
Okay, so we talked about hidden messages,
Yeah.
the potential for like darker themes
Mm-hmm.
in these seemingly innocent films.
Ah.
But I'm curious, what about Walt Disney himself?
Ooh.
Was he consciously trying to shape cultural values through his storytelling?
Now that's a question.
Yeah.
That has sparked countless debates.
Right.
And probably deserves its own deep dive.
Yeah.
Was Walt simply an entertainer?
Uh-huh.
Or was he a visionary who understood the power
Right.
of fairy tales to influence hearts and minds?
It's interesting because Disney's version of Beauty and the Beast
Yeah.
is a perfect example. It's a
Okay.
beloved classic.
Right.
But when you look at it through a certain lens,
Uh,
it raises some interesting questions.
okay.
Like, Belle is essentially a prisoner in the Beast's castle,
Right.
and yet she falls in love with him.
Yeah.
Some argue this could be interpreted as a case of Stockholm Syndrome.
Uh-huh.
So how do you reconcile that with the film's message of
Right.
true love conquering all?
You've hit on a crucial point.
Yeah.
How much of what we see in these films
Yeah.
is a reflection of Walt's own worldview? And how much is simply a product of the times in which he lived?
Right.
To answer that,
Yeah.
we really need to delve deeper
Right.
into both the man and his legacy.
Let's do it. But before we get lost in the history books,
Okay.
I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier. This
Yeah.
idea that Disney sanitized these classic fairy tales.
Right.
Like, we all know the Grimm brothers versions were pretty gruesome,
Uh-huh.
but is that really a bad thing?
That's where things get really interesting, right?
Okay.
By removing some of the darker, more violent elements,
Yeah.
did Disney lose something essential? Did they create a false sense of reality?
Right.
A world where the bad guys always get their comeuppance
Yeah.
and everyone lives happily ever after?
It's almost like they're presenting a sanitized version of reality
Yeah.
where all the unpleasantness is simply edited out.
Right.
But wouldn't you agree that some of those darker elements are important?
Absolutely.
Like, they teach us about the consequences of our actions,
Right.
about the complexities of good and evil.
Ah.
Are we doing a disservice to children by shielding them from that?
That's a question worth pondering, isn't it?
Right.
Are we creating a generation that's ill-equipped
Right.
to deal with the harsh realities of the world?
Yeah.
Or are we simply protecting their innocence while they're still young?
It's a tough call.
It is.
And it makes me wonder about the long-term impact
Mhm.
of these sanitized stories, you know?
Yeah.
Do they shape our expectations of the world, of relationships,
Right.
of happily ever afters?
Yeah.
It's food for thought.
Absolutely. And that's precisely why
Yeah.
we're having this conversation.
Wow. Right.
To dig beneath the surface and explore the hidden depths
Yeah.
of these beloved stories.
I'm so glad we're doing this.
Me too.
It's like we're seeing Disney through a
Totally.
whole new lens.
Right.
And it's pretty fascinating.
It is.
Okay, so we laid the groundwork.
Yeah.
We've talked about hidden messages, questionable themes, and the sanitization of fairy tales.
Right.
Now I'm ready to dive deeper into the man
Okay.
behind the magic, Walt Disney himself.
Let's do it.
All right, but for now,
Okay.
we will leave you with that thought. Don't go anywhere.
All right.
We'll be right back with more of your deep dive into Disney darkness.
Sounds good.
Welcome back to your deep dive.
Yes.
We're picking up right where we left off, exploring this idea that Disney movies might be more than just entertainment.
Right.
But before we get back to Walt,
Okay.
I have to ask, what's been the most surprising thing for you so far?
It's funny.
Yeah.
It's the recurring theme of control that really kind of stands out to me.
Okay.
When you think about like those classic Disney villains,
Mm-hmm.
they're often obsessed with power,
Yeah.
whether it's ruling a kingdom or like forcing someone to marry them.
It's like the bad guys are always trying to impose their will on others.
Exactly.
And the good guys have to like fight to break free
Right.
from that control.
And it makes you wonder,
Yeah.
how much do those themes like reflect or even reinforce
Right.
certain power structures in society?
Mm-hmm.
Are we subconsciously absorbing these ideas about who has control and who doesn't?
That's a good point. And it's not just the villains.
Right.
Even some of the heroes are driven by this desire for control,
Huh?
even if it's presented as love or ambition.
Yes.
Like Ariel giving up her voice.
Okay.
She's literally sacrificing a part of herself to fit into Eric's world.
It's subtle,
Yeah.
but it's there.
Yeah.
And it's these subtle messages, the ones that we might not even be aware of,
Right.
that can be the most powerful.
Yeah.
Think about like how many times
Mm-hmm.
you've seen a Disney movie where a woman's happiness depends on finding a prince.
Whoa, I'm starting to see those old fairy tales in a whole new light.
Exactly.
But wouldn't you say that Disney has evolved over the years?
Sure.
I mean, look at Moana, Brave.
Yeah.
Those princesses are pretty independent.
That's true.
Yeah?
And I think it shows that even Disney isn't immune to like cultural shifts,
Right.
as society changes.
Yeah.
So too do the stories we tell.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't mean those older narratives have lost their power.
Right.
They're still part of our cultural DNA,
Yeah.
influencing how we think about everything from like gender roles
Yeah.
to what constitutes a happy ending.
It's almost like these stories become part of our collective subconscious,
Yes,
shaping our expectations without us even realizing it.
precisely. And that's why it's so important
Mm-hmm.
to examine these stories critically,
Right.
even the ones that we love.
Yeah.
We need to ask ourselves what messages they're conveying,
Uh-huh.
what values they're reinforcing,
Right.
and how those messages might be shaping our own worldviews.
Okay, so we need to be mindful
Yes.
of the stories that we consume,
Hmm.
even the ones that seem harmless.
Right.
But isn't there a danger in overthinking things?
Sure.
What happened to just enjoying the magic of Disney?
I think that's where finding that balance comes in.
Okay.
It's not about rejecting Disney
Yeah.
or becoming cynical about these stories.
Right.
It's about engaging with them on like a deeper level,
Uh-huh.
appreciating their artistry,
Right.
while also recognizing that they can be more than just entertainment.
It's like you said earlier,
Yeah.
it's like discovering a secret passageway in a familiar house.
Exactly.
We can still enjoy the house, but now we have this like richer, more complex understanding of its history and its secrets.
Precisely. And sometimes those secrets
Yeah.
can be pretty revealing.
Okay.
For example, the script that we're looking at
Yeah.
mentions the evolution of fairy tales.
Right.
It points out how Disney often sanitized
Yeah.
the original stories,
Right.
removing some of the darker, more violent elements.
We touched on that earlier.
Yeah.
With Cinderella.
Right.
The Grimm brothers version is pretty intense.
It is.
But why do you think Disney made those changes?
Well, I mean, obviously they wanted to make the stories more appropriate
Uh-huh.
for children,
Right.
but I think it goes a little deeper than that.
Okay.
By removing those darker elements,
Yeah.
Disney created a world where good always triumphs,
Right.
where there's always a happy ending,
Uh-huh.
where justice is always served.
It's like they're offering a sanitized version of reality,
Right.
which is kind of ironic considering they're adapting fairy tales.
Exactly. Fairy tales were originally cautionary tales.
Right.
Meant to teach children about the dangers of the world.
Uh-huh.
But Disney transformed them into these heartwarming stories
Yeah.
about hope and optimism.
Right.
And there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
But it's important to recognize the shift that occurred.
So are you saying that Disney is giving us a false sense of reality?
It's not really about saying it's right or wrong.
Right.
It's about understanding the implications of those changes.
Yeah.
When we're constantly exposed to stories
Mm-hmm.
where good always wins.
Right.
It can set up like unrealistic expectations
Okay.
for the real world where
Yeah.
things are much more complicated.
That's true. Life is full of gray areas.
Yes.
And sometimes the bad guys win.
Right.
Or at least they don't get punished.
Exactly. And perhaps by acknowledging that complexity,
Yeah.
by embracing like the darkness alongside the light,
Uh-huh.
we can create stories that are both entertaining
Right.
and more reflective of the world we actually live in.
So it's not about rejecting happy endings, but about recognizing that they're not always realistic or even desirable.
Exactly. And it's about understanding
Yeah.
that even in like the darkest of tales, there can be hope and beauty.
Okay, so we've talked about the sanitization of fairy tales,
Yes.
these recurring themes of control,
Right.
and the potential impact of these stories on our worldview.
Uh-huh.
Now I'm really curious to get back to Walt Disney himself.
Let's do it.
Yeah.
After all, he's the man behind the magic, the one who shaped these stories
Mm-hmm.
and brought them to life on the big screen.
I'm ready for some like behind the scenes secrets.
Oh, yeah.
Was he like a visionary genius?
Ah.
A shrewd businessman?
Okay.
Maybe a little bit of both.
That's what we're here to uncover.
Right.
And remember, to understand a story,
Yeah.
you have to understand the storyteller.
Let's get to it. We'll be back in just a moment with more of your deep dive. Welcome back to your deep dive. We've been talking about some pretty interesting stuff about Disney.
Yeah.
From like hidden messages to these sanitized fairy tales.
Right.
Now it's time to focus on the man behind the mouse, Walt Disney himself.
He's a legend, isn't he? A true American icon.
He is, but like all icons, he's a complex figure.
Right.
Like a man who was both a product of his time and a shaper of it.
Yeah, definitely.
So let's just get right down to it. Was Walt Disney consciously trying to push an agenda with his films? Or was he just like an entertainer, a storyteller who wanted to bring joy to audiences?
That's the question, isn't it?
Yeah.
The one that historians and cultural critics have been debating for decades.
Yeah.
I don't think there's a simple answer.
Right.
There's no smoking gun that just reveals Walt's true intentions.
Right.
But I think we can look at the evidence,
Yeah.
examine the context of his life and times,
Mm-hmm.
and try to piece together like a more nuanced understanding
Okay.
of the man and his legacy.
So where do we even begin?
Well, one way to approach this
Yeah.
is to think about the historical context,
Okay.
in which Walt was creating these films.
Yeah.
I mean, he was born in the early 1900s,
Right.
a time of rapid social and technological change.
Yeah.
America was becoming a global power,
Uh-huh.
but also grappling with things like poverty,
Right.
inequality,
Yeah.
social unrest.
Yeah. And in the midst of all that, Walt offered these stories of hope,
Exactly.
of escapism,
Right?
a world where good always triumphed over evil.
And it resonated with audiences.
Yeah.
People were looking for something to believe in,
No.
something to lift their spirits.
Right.
And I think Walt really tapped into that longing,
Yeah.
that yearning for like a simpler, more magical world.
But even in that magical world,
Yeah.
there are still messages being conveyed,
Uh-huh.
values being reinforced.
It's true.
Think about those classic Disney princesses.
Right.
They're often portrayed as passive,
Uh-huh.
just waiting for a prince to come and rescue them.
Right.
Is that simply a reflection of the times,
Mhm.
or was Walt consciously promoting those traditional gender roles?
It's probably a bit of both.
Yeah.
I mean, remember, Walt was a product of his time.
Right.
Those traditional gender roles were very ingrained in society.
Uh-huh.
It's likely that he at least subconsciously reflected those norms in his storytelling.
But wasn't he also a visionary?
Sure.
A man who pushed boundaries,
Ah,
challenged conventions?
yeah.
Couldn't he have chosen to portray women in a more empowered way?
He certainly could have.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to speculate on why he didn't. Perhaps he felt that those traditional stories,
Mm-hmm.
those classic fairy tales, held like a timeless appeal,
Yeah.
like a universal truth that transcended cultural shifts.
Right.
Or maybe he was simply catering to the expectations of his audience,
Right.
giving them what they wanted to see.
It's a fascinating puzzle.
It really is.
Trying to decipher the motivations
Okay.
of a man who left such an indelible mark on the world.
I think that's part of what makes Walt Disney so enduringly fascinating.
Yeah.
He's a figure who continues to spark debate,
Right?
to challenge us to think critically about the stories we tell
Uh-huh.
and the values that we hold dear.
Okay, so we may never know for sure what Walt's true intentions were,
Right.
but I think we can agree that his legacy is complex and multifaceted.
Yeah.
He gave us these magical stories that continue to enchant generations,
Mm-hmm.
but he also perhaps unwittingly reinforced certain social norms
Yeah.
that some find problematic.
And that's the beauty of it, isn't it?
Yeah.
These stories are open to interpretation.
Right.
They can be enjoyed on like a purely entertainment level,
Mm-hmm.
but they can also be analyzed,
Yeah.
dissected,
Right.
debated.
Yeah.
They're a reflection of who we are as a society,
Yeah.
both the good and the bad.
That's a great point.
Hmm.
So what's the takeaway from all of this?
Hmm.
How should we approach Disney films now,
Yeah.
knowing what we know about the man behind the magic?
I think the key is to be mindful,
Okay.
to be aware of like the historical context,
Mm-hmm.
to recognize that even the most beloved stories
Mm-hmm.
can reflect problematic values.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that we have to reject them entirely.
Right.
We could still appreciate the artistry, the creativity, the sheer joy that these films evoke.
It's about finding a balance,
Exactly.
embracing the magic,
Uh-huh.
while also acknowledging the complexity.
I agree. And it's about continuing the conversation,
Right.
asking tough questions,
Mhm.
challenging our own assumptions.
Because ultimately, that's how we grow,
Yeah.
how we learn,
Mm-hmm.
how we become more critical and informed viewers.
Said.
This has been a fascinating deep dive, to say the least.
It has.
We went from hidden messages
Yeah.
to sanitized fairy tales
Uh-huh.
to the man behind the mouse himself.
Right.
And I think we've all come away with a richer, more nuanced understanding of Disney and the power of storytelling.
I agree. It's been a pleasure exploring these ideas with you.
The pleasure was all mine, and to you, listening, thank you for joining us on this journey. Remember to keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep the magic of storytelling alive. But always remember to look beneath the surface, because you never know what you might find.